There is a quiet, invisible trap in the world of investing, and it does not discriminate by education, income, or professional achievement. In fact, the more impressive your credentials, the more dangerous this trap becomes. It waits patiently for the engineers, the doctors, the lawyers, the professors, and the analysts who believe that intelligence is their greatest advantage in building wealth. It watches as they construct elaborate mental models, run sophisticated calculations, and arrive at conclusions that feel absolutely airtight. And then, slowly, and sometimes all at once, it pulls them under. This is not a story about people who made foolish decisions. This is a story about people who made very smart decisions that turned out to be deeply wrong. It is a story about how the very habits of mind that helped brilliant people succeed in their careers quietly become the habits that sabotage their financial lives. It is a story about overconfidence dressed in the clothing of competence, about analysis, paralysis, wearing the mask of due diligence, and about the kind of pride that feels from the inside like perfectly reasonable caution. You may recognize yourself somewhere in these pages. You may recall a moment when you were absolutely certain about an investment, only to watch it collapse. You may remember a time when you spent weeks researching every possible option and ended up doing nothing at all while the opportunity disappeared. You may have felt the quiet sting of realizing that a friend with fewer qualifications and less knowledge somehow built more wealth than you did, and you never quite understood why. The answer is here, woven through every chapter of what follows. The journey begins now, and it starts where all great misunderstandings begin, at the very beginning of how the intelligent mind processes the world. Chapter 1. The Architecture of the Overconfident Mind. Every person who has ever been wrong about a major financial decision has something in common with every other person who has ever been wrong about a major financial decision. They were all certain they were right. That certainty, that unshakable inner conviction, is not a personality flaw that belongs only to the arrogant or the careless. It is, in fact, a structural feature of human cognition, and it becomes significantly more powerful, not less, in minds that have been rewarded repeatedly for being correct. To understand why intelligent people fall hardest into the trap of overconfidence, you have to understand how expertise actually works in the human brain. When you spend years mastering a subject, whether it is medicine, or engineering, or law, or software development, your brain builds dense, highly organized networks of knowledge and pattern recognition. You begin to see connections that others miss. You begin to solve problems faster and more accurately than people without your training. You receive feedback in the form of correct diagnoses, successful projects, favorable rulings, or functioning systems. Your brain registers this feedback and draws a reasonable conclusion. Your judgment is reliable. This is not a delusion. In your area of expertise, your judgment genuinely is more reliable than that of the average person. The problem begins when that sense of reliable judgment starts to bleed across domains. The brain does not come with a built-in alarm that sounds when you have crossed from a field where your training applies to a field where it does not. Instead, the same feeling of confident clarity that served you so well in one area accompanies you, uninvited and unchecked, into entirely different territory. A surgeon who has performed thousands of successful operations develops a deep, embodied trust in her own hands and mind. That trust is earned and justified in the operating room. But when she evaluates a biotech startup, the same neural architecture that produces surgical confidence is still firing. The feeling of knowing what she is doing is identical. The certainty feels the same. And yet the context has changed completely, and the track record that earned that confidence does not transfer. This phenomenon has a name in the field of behavioral economics. It is called the halo effect, combined with what researchers describe as overconfidence bias. Together, they create a mental environment in which the intelligent person does not merely overestimate their knowledge in a new domain. They also systematically underestimate the risk of being wrong, because being wrong is something that has not happened to them very often in the areas where they have spent the most time and effort. The data on this is both striking and uncomfortable. Studies comparing financial forecasters, investment professionals, and ordinary investors consistently show that increased confidence in a prediction is not matched by increased accuracy. In fact, the relationship sometimes runs in the opposite direction. The most confident predictions tend to be the least calibrated. meaning the gap between how sure someone is and how often they are actually right grows wider as confidence grows higher. What makes this especially treacherous for intelligent investors is the way that intelligence enables a particular kind of post hoc rationalization. When a smart person makes a decision and that decision turns out to be wrong, the story they tell themselves about what happened is often more sophisticated and more convincing than the stories told by people with less intellectual horsepower. They can construct narratives that explain why the failure was due to unpredictable external factors, or bad luck, or temporary market irrationality, rather than a fundamental flaw in their own reasoning. This narrative-building ability is not malicious or even entirely conscious. It is a natural output of the same intelligence that got them into the decision in the first place. The mind that can construct a compelling investment thesis can also construct a compelling explanation for why that thesis failed through no fault of its own logic. And so the overconfidence is never really corrected. It is simply repackaged and carried forward into the next decision. There is another layer to this architecture that deserves careful attention, and that is the role of complexity in creating false sophistication. Intelligent people are drawn to complexity. This is partly because complex problems are genuinely more interesting than simple ones, and partly because mastering complexity is how they demonstrated their value in their professional lives. When they encounter a complex financial instrument, a multi-layered investment strategy, or a sophisticated argument for why a particular asset is undervalued, there is a powerful pull toward engagement. Complexity feels like a puzzle worth solving, and solving it feels like confirmation of their intellectual worth. The danger here is that financial markets are not puzzles with hidden solutions waiting for smart enough people to find them. They are dynamic, adaptive systems in which every participant is simultaneously trying to find the same solutions. When a truly excellent insight exists in a market, it is typically captured very quickly by the fastest and most resourceful participants, leaving behind a world in which most opportunities have already been priced in. The intelligent individual investor who believes they have identified something the market has missed is, more often than not, engaging in a form of intellectual flattery rather than genuine discovery. But this realization does not come easily to people whose careers have been built on finding things that others have missed. A great doctor finds diagnoses that others overlooked. A great engineer solves problems that others gave up on. A great lawyer finds arguments that no one else thought of. The habit of finding what others have missed is deeply rewarded in professional life. Bringing that same habit to investing, without adjusting for the fundamental difference between professional expertise and market dynamics, is one of the most common and most costly mistakes that smart investors make. What begins to emerge from this analysis is a picture of the intelligent investor as someone whose very strengths set the stage for a specific kind of vulnerability. The confidence is real but misplaced. The analytical skills are genuine but applied to the wrong kind of problem. The pattern recognition is sharp but tuned to domains that do not translate. And the ability to construct compelling narratives makes it extremely difficult to receive the corrective feedback that might otherwise, over time, recalibrate the system. The architecture of the overconfident mind is not built from weakness. It is built from strength. That is precisely what makes it so difficult to dismantle, and precisely what makes the chapters that follow so important for anyone who recognizes even a trace of themselves in this description. Chapter 2. The Illusion of Understanding. There is a deceptively simple test that psychologists use to expose one of the most reliable features of human overconfidence, and it involves asking people to explain how ordinary objects work. Take a zipper. Most people, when asked if they understand how a zipper works, will say yes with reasonable confidence. They use zippers every day. They have watched them function. They have a general sense of the mechanism involved. But when asked to provide a detailed step-by-step explanation of exactly how a zipper closes and what happens at the molecular level of the interlocking teeth, the confidence evaporates almost immediately. The feeling of understanding, it turns out, was a feeling of familiarity masquerading as comprehension. This phenomenon, documented extensively by researchers and known as the illusion of explanatory depth, is particularly relevant to intelligent investors because their sophistication gives them access to a much larger vocabulary of familiarity. They know the names of financial instruments. They can describe the general concept of derivatives, options, futures, credit default swaps. collateralized debt obligations. They can speak about quantitative easing and yield curves and forward guidance with fluency. They understand the basic framework of discounted cash flow analysis and can follow an earnings report without losing the thread. All of this fluency creates a powerful sense of understanding. And yet, fluency is not comprehension. The ability to use a concept correctly in conversation is not the same as the ability to trace its full implications through a complex, interconnected system under conditions of stress and uncertainty. The distinction matters enormously in investing because markets are precisely the kind of complex, interconnected system where surface-level understanding fails catastrophically at the moments when understanding matters most. Consider what happened in the years leading up to the global financial crisis of 2008. Some of the most intelligent and highly credentialed people in the world were operating in the mortgage-backed securities market. They had doctoral degrees in mathematics and physics. They had built and could explain the models that priced these instruments. They understood the components of the system they were working in the same way that someone understands how a zipper works. Well enough to use it, well enough to talk about it, but not deeply enough to anticipate what would happen when conditions shifted in ways that fell outside the assumptions built into their models. The models assumed that housing prices across different regions of the country would not all fall simultaneously. This assumption felt reasonable based on historical data. The people who built the models were not stupid. They were, by most measures, extraordinarily intelligent, but their understanding of the system they were operating in was deep in some dimensions and completely blind in others. And the blindness was invisible to them because the fluency covered it over. For the individual investor, the illusion of explanatory depth works in subtler but equally dangerous ways. When an intelligent person reads a prospectus, a research report, or a financial news article about a company they are considering investing in, their brain is performing a kind of rapid integration of new information with existing mental models. They are not reading every word with full comprehension. They are skimming with pattern recognition, recognizing familiar structures and filling in gaps with assumptions drawn from past experience. This process is extraordinarily efficient in stable, familiar domains. It is how experienced professionals can process enormous amounts of information quickly and make good decisions under time pressure. But in financial markets, the familiar-looking patterns are often familiar for the wrong reasons. A business model that superficially resembles a successful past investment may have fundamentally different underlying economics. A financial metric that looks strong by one standard measure may be obscuring a structural weakness that only becomes visible under different conditions. The intelligent investor who reads quickly and confidently is often not reading the actual document in front of them. They are reading a mental template that the document triggered and confirming what they already expected to find. This is not carelessness. It is a consequence of how intelligence processes information at speed. The smarter and more experienced the reader, the more powerful the templates, and therefore the more powerful the tendency to see what is expected rather than what is actually there. One of the most illuminating examples of this pattern involves experts in technical fields who invest in companies within their area of expertise. The software engineer who invests in tech startups, the doctor who invests in pharmaceutical companies, the petroleum engineer who invests in oil and gas exploration. The assumption, entirely reasonable on its surface, is that their technical knowledge gives them an edge. They understand the technology, they can evaluate the product, they can assess the scientific merit of the pipeline, and they can. That part is real. What they often cannot do as well as they think is understand the business, the management, the competitive dynamics, the regulatory environment, the capital allocation history, or the dozen other factors that determine whether a technically excellent product becomes a financially excellent investment. They know the technology deeply, but they mistake that deep knowledge for complete knowledge. The parts they understand well create a false floor of confidence beneath all the parts they understand less well. This is the illusion of explanatory depth at its most dangerous. Not the simple case of thinking you understand something you do not, but the subtler and more treacherous case of understanding some things very well and allowing that partial understanding to generate confidence about the whole. The corrective for this is not to understand less, obviously, but to become genuinely curious about the boundaries of your understanding. The investors who navigate this illusion most successfully are those who have developed a habit of asking themselves a specific kind of question. Not just what do I know about this, but what would I need to understand about this that I currently do not, in order to be confident in this decision? And then honestly assessing whether they have the time, the access to information, and the genuine capability to close those gaps before committing capital. This habit sounds simple. It is deceptively difficult to practice because the very fluency that creates the illusion also makes the question feel unnecessary. When you already feel like you understand something, the impulse to probe the edges of that understanding is much weaker than when you feel confused. And intelligent people, almost by definition, feel confused less often than other people. Which means the corrective impulse fires less frequently in the minds that need it most. Chapter 3. Analysis Paralysis and the Perfectionism Trap. If overconfidence is the shadow cast by intelligence in one direction, analysis paralysis is the equally dangerous shadow cast in the opposite direction. And it is important to understand that these two patterns are not opposites or contradictions. They often inhabit the same mind, alternating or even coexisting in ways that produce a particularly frustrating and costly form of financial self-sabotage. The intelligent person who is overconfident in one area can, paradoxically, be paralyzed by uncertainty in another. The same mind that rushes too quickly to judgment about a familiar-seeming opportunity can spend months unable to make any decision at all about a situation where the complexity feels genuinely irreducible. This is because intelligence does not resolve uncertainty. It reveals it. And for minds trained on problems with correct answers, irreducible uncertainty can feel not just uncomfortable but almost morally unacceptable. Consider the way that intelligent people are educated and rewarded throughout their lives. Academic excellence is measured by the ability to find correct answers. Professional success is often tied to producing correct analyses, correct diagnoses, correct legal arguments. The feedback loop of intelligent achievement is built around getting things right, which means that the experience of not being able to determine what the right answer is can trigger a kind of cognitive and emotional distress that feels very different from ordinary uncertainty. For many highly intelligent investors, the response to this distress is to gather more information. If the uncertainty is uncomfortable and unresolved, the solution is to analyze more deeply, read more broadly, model more carefully. This feels productive. It feels responsible. It is, in many ways, the same impulse that served them so well in academic and professional settings. When a dissertation needed to be stronger, you did more research. When a diagnosis was unclear, you ordered more tests. When a legal argument had gaps, you found more precedents. The problem is that in financial markets, there is always more information available. The supply of data, analysis, research reports, expert opinions, historical precedents, and competing frameworks is essentially infinite. No amount of reading will ever reach a point of complete clarity because complete clarity does not exist in investing. The market prices in information continuously, and the information environment changes faster than any individual analyst can process. The pursuit of certainty through more analysis is, in financial markets, a pursuit with no terminus. And so the paralyzed, intelligent investor gathers more and more information, refines and re-refines their model, adds new variables, considers new scenarios, asks more questions, reads more reports, and never quite reaches the point where the decision feels fully justified by the evidence. Meanwhile, the opportunity they were considering either ripens and passes or gets priced in by other market participants who were less concerned with perfect certainty and more concerned with acting on reasonable probability. There is a specific cognitive pattern that underlies this paralysis, and it is called loss aversion asymmetry, combined with regret anticipation. Intelligent people who have strong self-concepts built around making good decisions tend to experience the anticipated regret of a wrong decision as significantly more painful than the anticipated regret of inaction. If they act and they are wrong, that is a concrete, attributable failure of judgment that will be part of their mental record. If they do not act and the opportunity was real, that is a missed opportunity, which is less painful partly because it is counterfactual and partly because it can be explained by the ongoing uncertainty that justified the waiting. This asymmetry means that intelligent investors systematically underweight the cost of inaction. They feel the potential downside of investing vividly and concretely, and they feel the potential downside of not investing abstractly and incompletely. The mind naturally reaches for the option that avoids vivid, concrete pain, which is the option of not deciding. Perfectionism compounds this dynamic significantly. Many highly intelligent people carry a deep-seated belief that if they think hard enough about something for long enough, they will eventually arrive at a level of clarity that justifies decisive action. This belief is reinforced by experiences in other domains where persistence and rigor did eventually yield clarity. But it is a fundamentally mistaken model for how investing works. Clarity is not a destination you reach by thinking harder. Uncertainty in markets is irreducible and structural. The decision to invest is always a decision made under uncertainty, and the question is never whether you have eliminated the uncertainty, but whether the expected value of acting under that uncertainty is positive. Successful investors, including those with high intelligence, learn to make decisions with a specific kind of comfort with incompleteness. They understand that they will never know everything relevant to a decision, and they develop a framework for determining when they know enough to act. This framework is not about satisfying an internal standard of certainty. It is about meeting an external standard of process. Have I considered the key variables, assessed the major risks, sized the position appropriately for my level of confidence, and defined the conditions under which I would change my view? When those process conditions are met, action is justified regardless of whether the uncertainty has been resolved. For many intelligent investors, adopting this kind of process-based standard requires a genuine reorientation of their relationship to uncertainty itself. It requires accepting that being wrong sometimes, when acting on good process, is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of operating in a probabilistic environment. And it requires recognizing that waiting for certainty that will never come is not wisdom. It is a disguised form of fear. Chapter 4. The Curse of Knowing Too Much. There is a concept in economics called the curse of knowledge, and it describes a phenomenon that anyone who has ever tried to explain something complex to someone who does not share their background has experienced firsthand. Once you know something deeply, it becomes nearly impossible to imagine not knowing it. The knowledge is so thoroughly integrated into your mental model of the world that you lose access to the perspective of someone for whom that knowledge is absent. In teaching, this manifests as the expert who gives lectures that are incomprehensible to beginners, not because the expert is unkind or unaware that beginners exist, but because they have literally lost the ability to simulate what it feels like to encounter this material for the first time. The knowledge colors everything they say and structures every explanation they give in ways they cannot fully control. In investing, the curse of knowledge creates a specific and underappreciated form of disadvantage. The investor who knows too much about a particular industry, company, or technology often finds it increasingly difficult to see that investment the way the broader market sees it. And since the market price is ultimately determined by the aggregate behavior of all participants, most of whom do not share the expert's depth of knowledge, the expert's ability to predict price behavior can actually decrease as their knowledge increases. This sounds counterintuitive, and it is worth pausing on it carefully. How can knowing more about something make you worse at predicting how it will be priced? The answer lies in the difference between understanding fundamental value and understanding market psychology. A deep expert in a technology field might correctly understand that a particular company's technology is transformative, genuinely superior to its competitors, and positioned to capture significant market share over time. Every one of those assessments might be technically accurate. But if the market's timeline for recognizing this value is significantly longer than the expert expects, if the story takes years longer to play out than the fundamentals seem to suggest, then the expert's investment may underperform, not because they were wrong about the technology, but because they were wrong about the timing and the market's willingness to price in what they can see clearly. The curse of knowledge makes the expert think that what is obvious to them must become obvious to the market quickly. They can hardly imagine a world in which this truth goes unrecognized for extended periods, because for them, it is not a subtle or uncertain truth. It is as clear as day. But markets are made up of millions of participants with varying levels of knowledge, varying time horizons, varying risk tolerances, and varying access to capital. The speed at which information propagates through this system is not determined by the clarity of the information itself. It is determined by a complex interplay of factors that has almost nothing to do with how obvious the truth seems to the person who understands it most deeply. Beyond timing, the curse of knowledge creates another problem that is less obvious but equally costly. Deep expertise tends to narrow the range of hypotheses that the expert considers seriously. Once you know an industry extremely well, your mental model of that industry becomes so well developed that it is very difficult to genuinely entertain scenarios that fall outside its parameters. The deeply knowledgeable investor has seen how things work in their domain. They have mental precedents for most of the patterns they observe. And those mental precedents, while usually helpful, can become a kind of filter that screens out genuinely novel developments. Innovation, in particular, is notoriously difficult for experts to evaluate accurately, because truly disruptive innovations are, by definition, things that do not fit well within existing mental models of the industry. The experts in the existing industry often see most clearly why the new approach is technically inferior, operationally challenging, or financially implausible by the standards of the current landscape. What they sometimes cannot see as clearly is how the new approach might define an entirely different landscape where their existing benchmarks no longer apply. The history of technology is filled with examples of deeply knowledgeable industry experts who correctly identified specific flaws in new technologies and incorrectly concluded from those flaws that the technologies would fail to achieve significant adoption. The telecommunications engineers who dismissed the early internet as too slow for practical use were not wrong about the speed. They were wrong about how quickly the speed problem would be solved and how radically different user behavior would become once it was. The intelligent investor who is also a domain expert needs to cultivate a specific kind of epistemic humility that is different from, and in some ways more difficult than, the general epistemic humility we discussed in earlier chapters. They need to stay genuinely open to the possibility that what they know best is precisely the thing that is about to change most dramatically. And they need to maintain the ability to evaluate an investment not only through the lens of their own deep knowledge, but also through the simpler, less sophisticated lens through which the majority of market participants will eventually form their view. This is not a suggestion to ignore deep knowledge. Deep knowledge remains an advantage, particularly in identifying fundamental value over long time horizons. But it needs to be paired with a sustained awareness of its own limitations, and specifically with the awareness that depth of knowledge about a subject does not translate automatically into depth of knowledge about how that subject will behave as a market-priced asset. Chapter 5. Pattern Recognition Gone Wrong. One of the most valuable cognitive tools that human intelligence has developed over millions of years of evolution is pattern recognition. The ability to identify recurring structures in complex environments, to notice that this situation resembles that previous situation and therefore warrants a similar response, is foundational to learning, expertise, and survival. In virtually every domain of human achievement, the ability to recognize patterns quickly and accurately is a mark of mastery. In financial markets, pattern recognition is everywhere. Technical analysts study charts looking for recurring formations. Fundamental analysts look for business models that resemble previously successful companies. Macro investors look for economic conditions that resemble historical precedents. Even quantitative investors build systems that are, at their core, machines for recognizing and acting on statistical patterns in data. Pattern recognition in investing is not inherently wrong. There are real patterns in financial markets. Some of them persist long enough to be exploitable. The challenge is that intelligent people, precisely because their pattern recognition is highly developed and highly rewarded, tend to see patterns everywhere, including in places where there are no real patterns, but only noise that the mind has organized into a convincing but illusory structure. This tendency is called apophenia in psychology, which is the general human tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. In financial contexts, it manifests most visibly in the realm of technical analysis, where chart patterns are given names and assigned predictive power based on their visual resemblance to past situations. The human visual cortex is extraordinarily good at finding shapes and structures in random data. Present it with a price chart and it will find heads and shoulders and double tops and cup and handle formations with impressive regularity, whether or not those formations have any actual predictive content. But the problem goes deeper than chart reading. Intelligent investors who have built successful mental models of particular business types or economic environments often find themselves applying those models to situations that superficially resemble the situations where the models worked, but which differ in ways that matter enormously. The business that looks like a past 10 bagger because it has similar surface characteristics, high margins, network effects, a large addressable market, a charismatic founder, may have a fundamentally different competitive environment, a different capital structure, or a different regulatory situation that makes the historical pattern a misleading guide. The insidious quality of sophisticated pattern recognition is that it produces stories, not just impressions. When an intelligent investor recognizes a pattern, they do not merely register a vague similarity. They construct a narrative that links the current situation to the historical precedent in rich and compelling detail. They can explain exactly why this company is like the early days of that company. They can articulate the mechanism by which the same economic forces that drove that outcome will drive this one. The story is detailed, internally consistent, and feels deeply persuasive, especially to the person who constructed it. This narrative construction is both the power and the danger of sophisticated pattern recognition. The narrative makes it feel like understanding, because understanding does feel like having a story that explains the data. But there is a crucial difference between a story that explains and a story that predicts. A story can fit the data available perfectly while being completely wrong about what comes next, because the future will bring data that the pattern did not anticipate. The financial markets are, among other things, a machine for punishing overconfidence in historical patterns. Every time a pattern becomes sufficiently well-known and widely followed, it tends to get arbitraged away, because the market participants who act on the pattern early extract the returns and leave nothing for those who act later. The pattern persists in the data of the past, but not in the returns of the present. The intelligent investor who learned the pattern from historical research and built a compelling narrative around it arrives to find that the opportunity has already closed. This dynamic creates a particularly painful experience for investors who pride themselves on thorough research. They did the work, they found the pattern, they built the model, they waited patiently for the signal. And then the pattern did not repeat, or repeated once but not again, or repeated in a form just different enough to produce a loss instead of a gain. The intelligent response to this experience is to question the pattern matching approach. The common response is to conclude that the execution was slightly wrong, the timing was slightly off, the position was sized incorrectly, and to refine the pattern rather than abandon it. This refinement process can go on indefinitely, with each iteration producing a more elaborate version of the pattern that fits the historical data better and better, but generates increasingly overfit predictions that perform worse and worse in new environments. The intelligent investor, whose pattern recognition and narrative-building capabilities are their pride, can spend years and significant capital in this cycle of recognizing patterns that do not hold, refining the model, and searching for the next pattern, never quite confronting the possibility that the fundamental approach itself is the problem. The corrective involves not the suppression of pattern recognition, which would be both impossible and counterproductive, but the cultivation of what might be called adversarial humility. The deliberate, disciplined practice of asking, for every pattern identified, what is the strongest possible argument that this pattern is not real, not persistent, or not applicable to this specific situation? This question needs to be answered with the same intellectual rigor and creative effort that went into constructing the original pattern narrative. If the adversarial case cannot be dismissed on its own terms, the pattern should be held much more lightly than the initial excitement of recognition would suggest. Chapter 6. The Confidence-Competence. Mismatch in financial decision-making. There is a well-documented relationship between confidence and competence that operates differently in different domains, and understanding this relationship is critical for any intelligent investor who wants to avoid the most predictable forms of self-sabotage. In domains with clear feedback and stable rules, confidence and competence tend to align over time. The surgeon who has performed thousands of operations and received immediate, unambiguous feedback about outcomes develops calibrated confidence. Their sense of certainty about a particular procedure correlates reasonably well with their actual likelihood of success. financial investing is categorically different from these domains in a way that has profound implications. The feedback in investing is delayed, noisy, and systematically misleading. A good investment decision can produce a bad outcome if the market behaves irrationally for longer than expected. A bad investment decision can produce a good outcome if a stroke of luck intervenes before the flaws in the reasoning are exposed. This means that the natural mechanism by which confidence and competence calibrate each other in other domains is severely compromised in investing. What this produces over time is a landscape populated by investors who have developed high confidence through a sequence of successful outcomes that may have had as much to do with favorable market conditions or fortunate timing as with the quality of their decision-making. They feel competent because they have been rewarded. They are rewarded not necessarily because they are competent, but because the market environment during their learning years happened to favor their approach. This is particularly dangerous for investors who came of age during a specific market regime. An investor who spent their formative years in a powerful bull market, learning how to invest and building early success during a period when most things went up, develops a set of intuitions and mental models that are calibrated to that specific environment. Their confidence feels earned, and in a narrow sense it is, because their approach genuinely did produce results. But the results were produced in conditions that may not recur, and the confidence they built does not carry with it any information about how their approach will perform in different conditions. The history of markets is full of investors who were spectacularly successful for a decade or more, and then spectacularly unsuccessful thereafter, not because they got worse at what they did, but because what they did stopped working when the environment changed. Their competence was real but narrower than their confidence suggested. The feedback they had received over their successful years told them they were good at investing. It did not tell them the more nuanced truth, which was that they were good at investing in a particular kind of market environment, and that their skills had not been tested by conditions that would reveal the limits of their approach. For intelligent investors, the confidence-competence mismatch is further complicated by the tendency to attribute success to skill and failure to circumstance. When things go well, the mind naturally credits the analysis, the research, the framework, the decision-making process. When things go poorly, the same mind naturally finds external causes, market volatility, unexpected news, irrational behavior by other participants. This attribution asymmetry makes it very difficult to receive accurate information about the actual quality of your investment decision-making process, because the feedback is being sorted through a filter that is systematically biased toward flattering interpretations. Addressing this mismatch requires the development of a more rigorous personal performance tracking system than most investors maintain. Rather than remembering outcomes in the impressionistic way that the mind naturally does, with successes vivid and attributed to skill, and failures faded or attributed to luck, a genuinely calibrating investor needs to record decisions at the time they are made, with explicit documentation of the reasoning, the expected outcome, and the probability assigned to various scenarios. Then, when outcomes occur, the evaluation needs to compare not just the outcome to the expectation, but the quality of the reasoning process to an external standard, separate from whether the outcome was favorable. This kind of disciplined record-keeping is emotionally uncomfortable for many intelligent investors because it makes the gap between confidence and competence visible rather than invisible. Seeing in writing that you assigned a 70% probability to an outcome and it occurred 30% of the time over many decisions is a confrontation with evidence that the mind's natural sorting mechanisms work hard to avoid. But it is also the only honest path toward genuine calibration, and genuine calibration is the only foundation on which lasting investment skill can be built. Chapter 7: Social Proof, Contrarianism, and the Intelligent Investor's Dilemma. One of the great tensions in investing for intelligent people is the relationship between independent thinking and the wisdom embedded in market prices. The intelligent investor knows that markets are not perfectly efficient, that prices can deviate from fundamental values, and that contrarian thinking has produced some of the greatest investment returns in history. They also know, or should know, that most people who believe they are contrarian are not actually seeing something the market has missed. They are simply finding sophisticated reasons to disagree with a consensus that, on balance, is more likely to be right than they are. This creates a genuine dilemma. When should you trust your own analysis over the market's collective judgment? When should you defer to the weight of evidence embedded in prices? And how do you tell the difference between genuine insight and what might be called intellectual contrarianism for its own sake? The intelligent person's relationship with social proof is complicated from the start. Social proof, the tendency to look to the behavior of others as a guide to correct behavior in situations of uncertainty, is a powerful cognitive shortcut that serves most people reasonably well most of the time. But intelligent people often have a complicated, ambivalent relationship with following the crowd. Their identity has frequently been built around thinking independently, finding their own solutions, not simply accepting received wisdom. They may have been rewarded explicitly and repeatedly for thinking differently from the majority. This produces a systematic bias toward contrarian positions that has nothing to do with the quality of the evidence. The intelligent investor who encounters a popular investment thesis may find themselves instinctively looking for reasons to disagree, not because the evidence points toward disagreement, but because agreement with consensus feels, at some level, like intellectual submission. The very sophistication of their thinking allows them to find plausible-sounding reasons to take the opposite position, regardless of whether those reasons are actually compelling on their merits. True contrarian investing, the kind that has actually produced outstanding returns for the investors who practice it well, is not about reflexively disagreeing with consensus. It is about having a specific, well-grounded reason to believe that the consensus has made a particular error in a particular situation, and being willing to act on that belief with appropriate position sizing and time horizon. The genuinely contrarian investor is not contrarian as a personality trait or intellectual style. They are contrarian in specific instances where their analysis reveals a genuine disconnect between market price and fundamental value. The pseudo-contrarian intelligent investor, by contrast, adopts contrarian positions as an expression of intellectual identity. They are attracted to the counter-narrative, the overlooked opportunity, the misunderstood asset. Not necessarily because the evidence is compelling, but because being the person who sees what others miss is deeply satisfying to a mind that has built its self-concept around exactly that capability. The costs of this pattern are not always immediately visible. Sometimes pseudo-contrarian positions work out, not because the underlying analysis was sound, but because the contrarian narrative was eventually adopted by a wider audience and prices moved accordingly. This kind of success is particularly dangerous because it reinforces the habit without validating the process. The intelligent investor concludes that their independent thinking was vindicated, when actually they were lucky that a poorly grounded position happened to move in the right direction before the flaws were exposed. At the other end of the spectrum, social proof can exert an equally problematic influence on intelligent investors in the form of sophisticated consensus capture. When very smart, well-credentialed people are all saying the same thing about a particular investment or market environment, the intelligent investor who has learned to defer to expertise may find themselves deferring to a consensus of experts that is itself exhibiting all the characteristic flaws of overconfidence and groupthink. The intelligence of the consensus participants does not protect against these flaws. In some ways, as we have seen, it amplifies them, because smart people are better at building internally consistent rationalizations for shared beliefs. The resolution of this dilemma is not a formula, but a discipline. It requires the intelligent investor to separate, as cleanly as possible, the question of what they believe from the question of how they feel about the social dimension of holding that belief. It requires them to evaluate their contrarian positions with the same critical rigor they would apply to a consensus view, not asking whether the position is interesting or satisfying or intellectually stimulating, but asking whether the evidence genuinely supports it at the level of rigor that would justify committing capital. And it requires a genuine reckoning with base rates. If the vast majority of investors who believe they have identified a mispricing that the market has missed are wrong, then the prior probability that any given contrarian thesis is correct is low, regardless of how intelligent the person holding it is. Intelligence does not exempt you from base rates. It only gives you better tools for convincing yourself that this time is different. Chapter 8. Emotional Intelligence and Financial Decision-Making. For much of the history of economic thinking, the intelligent financial decision-maker was imagined as a rational calculator, someone who could correctly assess probabilities, discount future cash flows, and make decisions in pure accordance with expected utility theory. The emotions were viewed as interference, as noise that corrupted the signal of pure rational analysis. The smarter you were, presumably, the more you could suppress the emotional interference and make decisions on purely rational grounds. This model has been thoroughly dismantled by decades of research in behavioral economics and neuroscience. We now understand that emotions are not merely disruptive to decision-making. They are constitutive of it. Patients with damage to the emotional centers of the brain, while retaining their full intellectual capabilities, actually become worse at making practical decisions, not better. Without emotional input, the rational mind cannot prioritize among options, cannot generate motivation, and cannot integrate the kind of somatic wisdom, the bodily sense of right and wrong, that guides good judgment in complex, ambiguous situations. This means that the intelligent investor's relationship with their own emotions is not primarily a matter of learning to suppress or override them. It is a matter of developing a more sophisticated, more discerning relationship with emotional information, learning to distinguish between emotions that carry useful information and emotions that carry distorted information, and between emotional signals that should be incorporated into decisions and those that should be explicitly counteracted. Fear and greed are the two emotions most commonly discussed in the investing context, and for good reason. They are powerful, they operate quickly, and their effects on investment behavior are both well documented and economically significant. But for intelligent investors, fear and greed often manifest in less obvious and more intellectually dressed forms than the raw emotional states those words suggest. Greed, for the intelligent investor, does not usually feel like greed. It feels like conviction. It feels like the satisfying certainty that you have identified a genuinely exceptional opportunity that others have failed to see, that your analysis is correct and the market is wrong, that the potential return justifies any level of concentration in this position. The emotional engine driving this conviction is, at its core, the desire for the extraordinary outcome, the 10-bagger, the portfolio-making trade, the investment that confirms once and for all that your intelligence is genuinely superior to the market's collective judgment. Fear, for the intelligent investor, often does not feel like fear either. It feels like caution. It feels like due diligence. It feels like the responsible recognition that more research is needed, that the uncertainty is too high, that the risk is not adequately compensated. The emotional engine driving this caution is, at its core, the desire to avoid the vivid, concrete experience of being demonstrably wrong, which is among the most psychologically costly experiences for someone whose identity is built around being right. The task for the emotionally intelligent investor is to develop sufficient self-awareness to recognize these disguises when they are wearing them. Not to suppress the underlying emotions, which is neither possible nor desirable, but to identify when a feeling of conviction is being driven by the desire for validation rather than by genuine analytical strength. And to identify when a feeling of caution is being driven by fear of embarrassment rather than by genuine assessment of risk. This kind of emotional self-awareness is not something that can be learned from a book alone, though books can provide the framework. It is developed through practice, through the kind of honest record-keeping discussed in the previous chapter, and through the cultivation of a genuine observer's perspective on your own decision-making process. Some investors find this observer's perspective through meditation or other mindfulness practices. Others find it through working with a trusted advisor or partner who can reflect back their patterns from a more objective position. Still others find it through the discipline of writing out their investment reasoning before making decisions, which forces a confrontation between the story they are telling themselves and the evidence they can actually document. The goal is not to become an unemotional investor. That is neither achievable nor preferable. The goal is to become an investor whose relationship with their own emotional landscape is clear-eyed enough that the emotions inform decisions without distorting them, and wise enough to know the difference between the two. Chapter 9. The Complexity Trap and the Case for Simplicity. There is a powerful and persistent belief among intelligent investors that complexity in an investment strategy is a sign of sophistication, and that simple strategies are naive approaches suited to unsophisticated market participants. This belief is understandable, given that complexity is often a genuine marker of depth and rigor in professional and academic contexts. The complex analysis, the multivariable model, the elaborately constructed hedge. These feel like evidence of serious, careful thinking about a difficult problem. The empirical record of financial markets suggests something quite different, however. A remarkable body of evidence, accumulated over decades of academic research and practitioner experience, consistently shows that simple investment strategies outperform complex ones over long time horizons, often by substantial margins. The buy and hold index investor, following a strategy that requires almost no ongoing analysis or decision-making, consistently outperforms the large majority of actively managed funds, most of which employ extraordinarily intelligent people using sophisticated analytical tools and complex investment strategies. This outcome is not an accident or a statistical anomaly. It has a structural explanation that is worth understanding deeply, because understanding it properly is one of the most important and most difficult things an intelligent investor can do. Complexity in investment strategies creates costs, both explicit and implicit, at every layer of the investment process. Complex strategies require more active management, which means more transaction costs and more opportunities for implementation errors. They require more ongoing analytical attention, which means more opportunities for the cognitive biases we have discussed throughout this book to distort judgment. They require more confidence in the correctness of the analytical framework, which means the costs of being wrong about that framework are higher. And they require the sustained ability to execute consistently well in conditions that change over time, which is exactly the kind of sustained performance that is extremely difficult to maintain. Simple strategies, by contrast, do not require the manager to be right about anything very specific. A broadly diversified, low-cost portfolio does not make a bet on any particular company, sector, economic regime, or analytical framework. It simply captures the aggregate return of a large set of assets over time, which has historically been positive over sufficiently long time horizons, and which does not depend on any particular view about how the world works being correct. The intelligent investor who resists simple strategies typically does so on the basis of a belief that their intelligence and analytical capability will allow them to do better than this simple baseline. This belief is, statistically speaking, almost certainly wrong, and the evidence that it is wrong is so consistent and so thoroughly documented that it amounts to one of the most robust findings in all of empirical finance. Yet the belief persists, and it persists most stubbornly in the minds of the most intelligent and analytically capable investors, for reasons that should by now be familiar. Accepting that a simple strategy is likely to outperform a complex one requires accepting that your intelligence does not provide the edge in this domain that it provides in others. It requires giving up the narrative of the skilled investor whose research and analysis generates returns that justify the effort. It requires, in essence, accepting that in this particular arena, the appropriate response to a hard problem is not to think harder about it, but to simplify the question being asked. This is a genuinely difficult psychological shift for intelligent people to make. The mind that has been built around the value of thinking harder, of finding the non-obvious insight, of solving the puzzle that others cannot solve, finds it very uncomfortable to accept that the right answer to a complex problem might be to stop trying to solve it complexly and instead to adopt a simple rule that sidesteps the complexity altogether. There is a concept in decision theory called the recognition-primed decision model, developed by researcher Gary Klein from studying how experts make decisions under pressure, that is illuminating here. Expert decision makers in complex, high-stakes environments, including firefighters, military commanders, and emergency room physicians, often do not make decisions by carefully analyzing all available options and selecting the optimal one. They make decisions by recognizing a pattern, identifying a plausible course of action, and acting on it, checking mentally whether it seems workable and adjusting if not. The sophistication is in the rapid, experience-based pattern recognition, not in the complexity of the analysis. The most skilled investors often operate in a similar way, not through elaborate analytical complexity, but through well-calibrated judgment about simple principles applied consistently over time. They do not try to solve the whole puzzle of the market. They identify a small number of things they believe they can assess reliably, apply consistent criteria in those areas, and maintain the discipline not to act outside those areas regardless of how compelling a more complex opportunity might appear. The case for simplicity is not a case for laziness or for abandoning analytical rigor. It is a case for directing analytical rigor toward the question of which simple principles are genuinely robust, rather than toward the construction of elaborate strategies that feel sophisticated, but introduce layers of complexity that become liabilities rather than assets when market conditions change. Chapter 10. Building a decision framework that works against your biases. Everything discussed in the preceding chapters points toward the same fundamental conclusion. The biases and blind spots that make intelligent investors vulnerable are not character flaws that can be corrected by deciding to do better. They are structural features of how intelligent minds process information, and they require structural solutions. Knowing that you are susceptible to overconfidence does not make you less susceptible to overconfidence in the moment of decision. Knowing that you tend toward analysis paralysis does not make it easier to act when the uncertainty feels irreducible. Knowing that your pattern recognition may be fitting noise rather than signal does not silence the compelling narrative that the pattern recognition is generating. What works, to the extent that anything works, is not increased self-awareness alone, but systematic changes to the decision-making environment that make the biases less likely to dominate the outcome. These changes take the form of explicit process commitments that were made when the mind was in a reflective, unconflicted state, and that constrain the mind's behavior when it is in the more emotionally activated state of an actual investment decision. The most valuable of these process commitments is the pre-commitment to explicit criteria. Before evaluating any investment, the disciplined, intelligent investor defines in writing the criteria that an investment must meet to be considered, the conditions under which they would change their view after entering a position, and the maximum amount of capital they would commit regardless of how compelling the case becomes. These criteria are established in advance when the mind is calm and can think clearly about what genuinely matters, rather than in the heat of evaluation when the seductive pull of a compelling opportunity or the paralytic fear of a complex risk environment may distort the judgment. Pre-commitment to explicit criteria works against overconfidence by forcing the investor to confront the full set of requirements an investment must meet, rather than focusing selectively on the evidence that supports the thesis they have already formed. It works against analysis paralysis by providing a defined endpoint. When the criteria are met, action is warranted, and the search for additional certainty is not. And it works against the curse of knowledge by requiring that the criteria be written at a level of abstraction that forces the investor to consider factors outside their area of deep expertise, not just the factors they find most intellectually interesting. The second major process commitment is adversarial pre-mortem. Before committing to any significant investment, the investor explicitly imagines that it is several years in the future and the investment has been a complete failure. They then ask, what was the sequence of events that led to this outcome? What did I miss? What did I weight incorrectly? What turned out to be different from how I modeled it? This exercise is not pessimism. It is a cognitive tool for accessing the mind's genuine assessment of the risks in a position, which may be suppressed when the mind is focused on building the case for why the investment will succeed. Research on pre-mortem thinking shows consistently that it is more effective than standard risk assessment at identifying failure modes, specifically because it bypasses the motivated reasoning that tends to dominate when we are evaluating risks in investments we have already decided we like. By framing the analysis as explanation rather than prediction, and by giving permission for the outcome to be bad, the pre-mortem unlocks a different set of mental associations than the standard forward-looking risk assessment. The third process commitment involves position sizing as a humility mechanism. The size of a position in a portfolio should reflect not only the expected return, but also the investor's honest assessment of how reliable their knowledge is about the key variables driving that expected return. An investment where the key variables are in an area of genuine expertise might warrant a larger position. An investment where the case depends on variables outside the area of expertise, or where the analysis rests on historical patterns that may not persist, should be sized more conservatively regardless of how compelling the narrative is. This principle runs directly against the natural impulse to concentrate heavily in investments where conviction is high, because high conviction is usually a product of the biases we have been discussing rather than a reliable signal of analytical accuracy. The investor who has convinced themselves most thoroughly of a particular thesis is not necessarily the investor who is most likely to be right. They may simply be the investor whose confirmation bias, pattern recognition, and narrative-building capabilities are most fully engaged. Sizing positions in accordance with the reliability of the knowledge rather than the strength of the conviction is a systematic way to correct for this. The fourth process commitment is structured review, conducted at defined intervals and using written documentation of the original thesis. The human memory is not a reliable archive of investment reasoning. It is a reconstructive process that tends, over time, to bring the remembered past into alignment with the present state of affairs. An investor who made a bullish argument for a stock that subsequently declined will, if asked to recall their original reasoning, typically produce a version that is more cautious and more hedged than the original. The mind protects its self-concept by revising history. The only defense against this is documentation, writing out the full investment thesis at the time of entry, including the specific claims being made, the probabilities being assigned, and the conditions under which the thesis would be considered wrong. Reviewing this documentation at regular intervals provides an honest mirror that the reconstructive memory cannot distort, and it forces the investor to evaluate their actual reasoning process rather than a sanitized retrospective version of it. Together, these process commitments do not eliminate the biases that make intelligent investors vulnerable. They create a structural environment in which those biases are less able to dominate decision-making. And over time, the consistency of good process, maintained through the inevitable volatility of outcomes, is the most reliable pathway to the kind of calibrated investment performance that genuine intelligence, properly directed, makes possible. Chapter 11. When Smart Money Gets It Wrong Together. There is a particular quality of financial disaster that emerges not when foolish people make foolish decisions in isolation, but when brilliant people make brilliant decisions together, each decision reinforcing the others, all of them pointing in the same direction until the entire edifice collapses under the weight of its own collective certainty. These events are among the most instructive and most sobering in the history of markets, and they deserve careful examination by any intelligent investor who might be tempted to draw comfort from the idea that intelligence, in sufficient concentration, provides protection against catastrophic error. The story of long-term capital management is perhaps the most studied and most discussed example of this phenomenon. The firm was staffed by some of the most intellectually formidable people ever assembled in a single investment organization, including 2 Nobel laureates in economics, former vice chairman of major investment banks, and a collection of doctoral-level mathematicians and physicists whose models of financial markets were, by the standards of available theory at the time, genuinely excellent. The firm's early performance was spectacular, and its principles were, by the standards of their analytical framework, impeccable. The problem was not that the models were wrong in their domain. The problem was that the models were built on assumptions about the range of possible market behavior that seemed entirely reasonable based on historical data, but that turned out to be catastrophically inadequate when a genuine crisis arrived. The models assumed a degree of correlation stability and liquidity availability that held under normal conditions but failed precisely at the moment when the firm most needed them to hold. And the very intelligence and sophistication of the firm's leadership made it more difficult, not less, to identify and correct for this vulnerability because the models were so compelling and so mathematically rigorous that they created a kind of epistemic gravity that made it hard to take seriously the possibility that they were missing something fundamental. This pattern repeats with variations throughout financial history. The intelligent consensus that built and validated the pricing models for mortgage-backed securities in the years before 2008 was not composed of stupid people. It was composed of very smart people who shared a set of assumptions, who validated those assumptions against each other's models, and who created an intellectual environment in which dissent from the consensus required arguing against a wall of sophisticated mathematics and credential-validated expertise. The cost of dissenting was social and professional as well as intellectual, and the bias toward consensus that these costs created was systematically invisible to the participants in the consensus. This is the social dimension of the intelligent investor's blind spot, and it is perhaps the most dangerous manifestation of all the patterns we have discussed, because it operates at a collective level where individual reflection and individual process improvements have limited power. When the very smartest people in a room agree with each other, and when that agreement is backed by elaborate analytical frameworks and institutional prestige, the social and cognitive barriers to dissent become extraordinarily high, even for people who, in other settings, would consider themselves independent thinkers. The lesson here is not to be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, as we discussed in an earlier chapter. It is to maintain a particularly elevated degree of skepticism about any position that has become the consensus of a community of highly intelligent, highly credentialed experts. Not because smart people are always wrong, but because the process by which smart people reach consensus in institutional settings systematically suppresses dissent and amplifies shared assumptions in ways that are very difficult to perceive from the inside of the consensus. The investor who wants to protect against this kind of collective intelligence failure needs to develop relationships and information sources that are genuinely outside the consensus community. People who are coming to the same questions from different directions and different priors, and who have no social stake in the consensus being right. This is not comfortable or easy to maintain, especially for investors who operate within institutions where the consensus is powerful and where deviation from it carries professional risk. But it may be, in the long run, the most important structural protection available against the specific kind of catastrophe that happens when smart people are wrong together. Chapter 12. The Wisdom of Strategic Incompleteness. Everything in the intelligent investor's training and professional development pushes toward completeness. Complete analysis, complete models, complete understanding. The entire apparatus of modern finance education, the CFA curriculum, the MBA finance courses, the quantitative finance programs, is organized around the idea that better analysis, more thorough research, and more complete models produce better investment outcomes. This orientation toward completeness is not wrong in every respect. There are dimensions of investment analysis where greater thoroughness genuinely does improve outcomes. Understanding a business model more deeply, assessing management quality more rigorously, modeling the competitive dynamics of an industry more carefully, these forms of completeness add genuine value. But there is another kind of completeness that is not only unnecessary but actively harmful, and that is the attempt to resolve all uncertainty before acting. We have discussed this in the context of analysis paralysis, but the deeper point goes beyond the issue of action inhibition. The attempt to build a complete model of all the variables affecting an investment is not just unachievable. It is structurally misguided because a sufficiently complete model of an investment situation would be as complex as the situation itself, and therefore no more tractable than the original problem. The investors who navigate markets most successfully over long periods are not those who have built the most complete models. They are those who have identified a small number of variables that they believe are genuinely predictive, that they can assess with genuine reliability, and that are not already fully reflected in prices. Everything else they have, in a strategic sense, decided to be incomplete about. They have chosen their edges and accepted their ignorance everywhere else. This strategic incompleteness is not intellectual laziness. It is an expression of meta-level intelligence. The understanding that cognitive resources are finite, that the marginal return on additional analysis decreases rapidly past a certain point, and that the areas of genuine informational advantage are narrow enough that spreading attention across all possible variables dilutes rather than strengthens the overall analytical position. Warren Buffett's concept of the circle of competence is the most famous formulation of this principle. The idea is not that you should only invest in things you understand completely, which is an impossible standard, but that you should be very clear about where your understanding is genuinely better than the markets, and very disciplined about not acting outside that zone. The circle does not need to be large. It needs to be real. The investor who knows their circle is small but genuine has a significant advantage over the investor who believes their circle is large but is operating on the illusion of explanatory depth. For the intelligent investor who wants to apply this principle, the critical question is not what they know, but what they know better than the market. This is a much harder question to answer honestly, because it requires not just an inventory of knowledge, but a genuine assessment of comparative advantage. Do you know this company's technology better than the analysts who cover it? Do you understand this industry's economics better than the institutional investors who have been following it for decades? Do you have access to information or perspective that is genuinely differentiated from what is already embedded in the price? If the honest answer is no, then even a high level of knowledge does not constitute an investable edge. And for most investors, in most situations, the honest answer is no. The market has been thinking about most investable assets for longer, with more resources, and with access to more information than any individual investor can match in those specific assets. The intelligent investor who accepts this uncomfortable truth is in a far better position to identify the narrow areas where they do have a genuine edge and to focus their analytical energy there rather than spreading it across the entire investment universe in the hope that intelligence alone will be sufficient. The wisdom of strategic incompleteness is ultimately a wisdom about humility, but it is a specific, active kind of humility, not the passive humility of simply believing you might be wrong. It is the humility of deliberately choosing to be incomplete in most areas so that you can be genuinely sharp in a few. It is the wisdom of the craftsperson who chooses to master one tool deeply rather than acquiring a superficial familiarity with every tool in the workshop. And it is, in the end, the most practical and the most sustainable application of intelligence to the enduringly difficult problem of building wealth in financial markets. Chapter 13. Rebuilding Your Investment Identity. At the deepest level, the patterns described throughout this book are not primarily analytical problems. They are identity problems. The intelligent investor's greatest vulnerability is not their overconfidence in any particular thesis or their susceptibility to any particular bias. It is the way their investment decision-making has become entangled with their self-concept, with who they are and how they think about their own intelligence and capability. When investment decisions feel like expressions of identity, the feedback mechanism of markets becomes psychologically threatening in a way that goes well beyond financial discomfort. A wrong investment is not just a financial loss. It is a challenge to the self-narrative of the intelligent person who made it. And the mind that is defending a self-narrative does not process information the same way that a mind free of identity investment processes it. It is less open to disconfirming evidence, more motivated to find explanations that preserve the narrative, and more resistant to the kind of genuine learning that requires accepting that the way you have been thinking about something was fundamentally mistaken. This is why the process changes described in earlier chapters, while necessary, are not sufficient by themselves. They create better structure around the decision-making process, but if the underlying identity issue is not addressed, the intelligent investor will find ways around the structure when the identity is sufficiently threatened. The pre-commitment criteria will be reinterpreted. The pre-mortem will be conducted superficially. The position size limits will be rationalized away in the face of a sufficiently compelling conviction. The deeper work is the work of disentangling investment performance from self-worth. This means developing what psychologists call a more process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented identity in the investing domain. Rather than being a person who makes good investments, the reconstructed investor identity is built around being a person who follows a good investment process. The distinction sounds semantic, but it is psychologically fundamental. A process-oriented identity allows you to maintain self-respect and psychological stability in the face of bad outcomes, because a bad outcome does not mean the process was wrong. It means the inherent uncertainty of markets manifested in an unfavorable direction on this particular occasion. This identity reconstruction also involves developing a healthier relationship with the concept of not knowing. Many intelligent investors have built their self-concept around knowing. Knowing more than others, knowing earlier than others, knowing better than others. In investing, the appropriate relationship with not knowing is not something to be overcome or hidden. It is something to be named clearly, as we discussed in the context of strategic incompleteness, and incorporated honestly into the decision-making process. The investor who can say clearly and without shame, "I do not know enough about this to have an informational edge, and I therefore will not act on it," is exhibiting a form of investment intelligence that is rarer and more valuable than the ability to construct a compelling analytical case for any particular position. And the ability to say this requires that not knowing is not experienced as a failure of intelligence, but as an honest and appropriate response to a complex and uncertain environment. Building this reconstructed identity is not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice. Markets will continue to present situations that trigger the old patterns. The confident, intelligent mind will continue to find compelling narratives, recognize apparently significant patterns, and generate the feeling of certainty that precedes both excellent and disastrous decisions. The goal is not to silence these responses, but to develop a consistent practice of evaluating them honestly, through the lens of the process rather than the lens of the feeling, and of maintaining the discipline to act on the process, even when the feeling argues otherwise. The investors who achieve this reconstruction do not become less intelligent. They do not become less analytical. They do not become passive or indifferent. They become more honest with themselves, more disciplined in their process, and more genuinely curious about the boundaries of their own knowledge. And in the long run, this combination of honest self-awareness and disciplined process is, by a very significant margin, the most powerful investment advantage available to anyone operating in financial markets.